We'll, we'll give a few more minutes for people to sign in. So yeah, really excited to be here today. My name is Joan Boyce. I'm a SAMPS board member as well as a VP and GM at Biocompare, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this webinar, Podcast from the Pros. As I provide a brief intro about SAMPS and our panelists, we're going to kick off with a polling question because we want to learn more about you, our attendees, and would appreciate it if you could take the time to answer the first polling question. So there you see it. The answers to these questions will really help us better understand the audience makeup and will help guide the discussion. So thank you for that. Thanks for taking a few moments to answer these questions. For newcomers, a quick overview of SAMPS. Founded in 2012, SAMPS is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to connect and support sales and marketing professionals in life science and applied research, and helping them contribute to not only their organization, but their own personal growth. With membership being free and over 4,000 members already part of our community, we warmly invite you to join us if you haven't already. And if you are a member, thank you so much. And feel free to let your colleagues know that they can join too. SAMPS hosts a variety of educational events like this webinar and networking activities. Last year, we hosted highly successful, well-attended and engaging meetings in Glasgow and Boston, focusing on all things AI. This year, we're excited about our upcoming meeting in Berlin, which will follow ESHG, and another event planned in the US this fall with the location soon to be revealed. SAMPS also holds an annual award ceremony focused on recognizing the best and brightest in our industry, which is also scheduled to take place this fall. So be sure to check out our website, samps.org, for more details. And since we're a nonprofit organization, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, for it's with their support that we're able to carry out our mission. So please be sure to visit the sponsor section of our website to learn more about our sponsors. And now for the main event, I'd like to join you and like you to join me in welcoming our panelists for today's webinar. These two individuals, they're not only esteemed colleagues, we've known each other for so long, I consider them dear friends. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and on behalf of SAMPS as well. So first is Chris Connor. I'm sure many of you know Chris. Chris is the founder and host of Life Science Marketing Radio. He has produced over 250 podcast episodes for himself and clients. And over the past 9 years, he's got a who's who of a guest list. It's included marketers, CEOs, Olympic champions. I totally want to hear about that. 2 Nobel Prize winners, a 6-year-old science podcaster, as well as myself. So anyway, Chris, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Excellent. And next up is Paul Avery. And again, I'm sure many of you know Paul. Paul started his career with a PhD in developmental biology at Cambridge before moving into scientific communications in 2010. Paul is now CEO of Biostrata, a specialist life science marketing agency. He currently hosts and co-produces 2 podcasts, one called Artificially Intelligent Marketing and another podcast called Life Science and Marketing. So thank you, Paul, so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been planned in the works for a long time, so I'm glad it's finally kicked off and come to fruition. So both Chris and Paul will be sharing their experiences with working on podcasts, and we're gonna have a lively discussion. So I'd also like to have a little special shout out to fellow SAMPS board member Adam, who is helping out behind the scenes. So thanks so much, Adam. And now it looks like we have some results here from our poll with your current involvement in podcasts. So some of you are new to the podcasting world. You're a guest, you've been a guest, you're considering starting your own podcast. So this is great. Thank you so much. Before we begin the lively discussion, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping items. So note we're recording the session, and a link to the recording will be distributed at a later date. During the webinar, we'll be taking questions from the audience, so feel free to put your questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom. And I'll be sure to check this often and include questions from the audience during the webinar. so we can answer all your questions if possible. Before we begin our panel discussion, I'll be sharing some podcast fun facts, which will help set the stage for what I'm sure will be a really lively discussion. And at this time, we're going to ask you to answer our last polling question. The answers you will provide will kind of really help us shape the discussion and focus. So Adam, if you wouldn't mind launching the next polling question, that would be fantastic. Here we go. So we really would like to know what aspects of podcasting you're most interested in learning about during the webinar, so we can tailor the questions and make sure we're hitting on the pertinent topics. So if we could take a few minutes, if you'd like to answer these questions, that would be really, really helpful. So we'll give that a few moments. Thank you. So let's see. While that's airing, a few podcast fun facts. So I thought I would just start out in preparation for this webinar. I was really trying to understand when podcasting originated, and saw that it had originated in 2003. And the first podcast was called Radio Open Source, and that was released by a Boston-based TV and radio personality. And what I thought was pretty cool, in 2005, podcasting was made a word of the year by the New Oxford American Dictionary. And George Bush actually became the first president to deliver a weekly podcast. So podcasting's been around for a while. I did also want to note that in 2006, so next slide, Adam, in 2006, I was actually working at the magazine Gen, and back then we started a podcasting series called GenCast Network. So I had a little bit of fun, and I went on to Wayback Machine and just took a screenshot of kind of what that looked like. And so, boy, I tell you, it's been a long, podcasting's been around for a long, long time. I believe they're still doing it, so, which is great. Okay, so what is it like to date? To date, there are so many podcasts within life sciences. This is just a screenshot of Apple's page and some of the podcasts that are there. So, clearly podcasting has taken off. And on the next slide, you'll see that I gathered some data from a site called Backlinko. And we can see that podcast growth and trends, it's continuing to grow at a nice steady rate in terms of consumption. So podcasting is definitely here to stay. I'm sure many of you listen to podcasts and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely a phenomenon. This next slide, no surprises here. The majority of people use smartphones when they're listening to their podcasts. The next slide kind of shows something which I kind of thought was true, but this kind of validated it. I know it's my podcasting behavior. I don't know if it's yours, Chris or Paul, but 59% of people listen to podcasts while they're doing something else. So they're clearly multitasking. The data supported that about 32% of people were doing it when they're commuting or traveling. And interesting to note that Monday through Friday seem to be a more popular podcast dates than the weekend. And so the next fun fact is platforms. There's so many podcast platforms. And I know that Chris and Paul will be getting into recommendations and tips that you'll have for people when they're thinking about starting a podcast, what tools they can use to upload them. But the two podcast platforms that seem to be the most predominant for uploading is Apple and Spotify. And clearly here you can see that as far as downloads goes, Apple totally rules, with Spotify coming in second, but a short second. And the last fun fact is, how many downloads can I expect? And Paul, you shared with me this podcast host, some data there, which I thought was really great. So if you're currently producing a podcast, and if your podcast within 7 days of release get 121 downloads or more, you're in the top 25% of podcasts. So this is just to help us set the stage with regards to, how many downloads you can expect. So yeah, so those were the little fun facts I wanted to share. I don't know if Chris, Paul, if you had any comments or if you had any aha moments when seeing those results.
I would just point out that even though Apple dominates in downloads, I
Mm-hmm.
imagine Spotify gets a lot just from streaming. So you go into Spotify and you play it. And when you distribute your podcast to Apple or Spotify, particularly Apple, I think, is where a lot of the other apps that you would use to get your podcast pull from. So that's
Got
probably
it. Okay.
explains the difference there. But
Explains the difference. Yeah, that makes sense.
but if you get it on both, you're pretty much good to go.
Excellent. Cool.
Right.
So now we'll get into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So let's see. I'll start. If Chris, you can answer first, and then Paul. I mean, certainly you've been doing podcasting a long time. 250 episodes under your belt, Chris. That's pretty phenomenal. What inspired you to start podcasting, and can you share a little bit about your journey there?
Yeah, so I started. So my last company I worked for was Thermo. Before that, Agilent and Varian. And when I went out on my own, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, but I was blogging. That was the thing. And back in
Mm-hmm.
2013, I was writing a blog every other week, and I found it really difficult to come up with an idea and write something well enough to put it out. And I felt like I was just lecturing to my audience, like,
Oh,
you should do
okay.
this and you should do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought, I know a lot of smart people and I'm listening to podcasts. I thought, if I don't start one, someone else will. So I'll just ask all my marketing friends about what they know. And that's how I got started. It's
Oh.
so much easier than it's easier to talk to your friends than to figure out what to write every other week.
No, absolutely, absolutely. In prepping for this, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to be talking to my friends. So it just came naturally. So how about yourself, Paul? What kind of inspired you to start your two podcasts?
Yeah, I'm relatively new to I'm sort of a long time listener, first time caller to
Okay.
the podcast game. I've got a little bit of imposter syndrome actually being sat here with both of you, having been
No,
doing it for a
no.
number of years. But I think there's a couple of reasons I got into it. First, I just looked at my behavior change and then I validated this with colleagues in the industry. And
Mm-hmm.
from a marketing perspective, the amount of long form content that personally I was consuming was reducing. I wasn't really
Right.
downloading many
Mm-hmm.
ebooks. I wasn't even reading many blog posts, if I'm honest. I was just maybe scam reading stuff. But more and more, I was trying to leverage the spare time that I had to gather information by listening to a podcast while I was doing other
Mm-hmm.
stuff, a little bit like the data that you showed earlier. You combine some of those trends with the rise of AI, and I've been quite vocal about the
Mm-hmm.
pros and cons of that at different SAMS events. But one of the things that I think is really going to impact how we consume content is rubbish AI generated content that says the same things that everyone else says, and our ability
Mm-hmm.
to churn that out at scale is going to potentially ruin content marketing from a written content perspective. And I really strongly believe that as consumers, we're going to crave authentic human contact and
Mm-hmm.
content from humans. And what better way than webinars like this or a podcast? And
Mm-hmm.
I know we're going to talk about some of the aspects of this a bit later. So I think the main driver for us was to get ahead of that curve and invest in producing our own content that was human and authentic. And then there's so many benefits off the back of that where you can repurpose that content. So you can still
Mm-hmm.
create the written form blog posts and longer form content, but you can do it off the back of your podcast. So that was the main driver for us to get into it. And like Chris said, one of my podcasts is just me nerding out with my friend Martin about AI. Like I do it almost entirely for me, and if other people happen to listen to it, then great. But yeah, that's mostly because I was going to nerd out on it anyway. I might as well record it and see if other people find it beneficial.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I hear what you're saying with regards to the written content, the advent of AI, and I think this our particular webinar I think is very timely because while companies may not have thought about incorporating podcasting as part of their marketing strategy for the reasons you just described, I think it's something that definitely should be considered. And so to that end, so, why might a company want to start a podcast and how can this aid them in their marketing goals? You did touch upon that a little bit, Paul, but I'd like to expand upon that a little bit more, given what you said.
Do you want me to take it first?
Yeah, you go, Chris.
Okay.
Um,
Thanks,
it,
Chris.
So I think, the best place the podcast fits in the journey is generating awareness for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one way to be found, and to have people get to know who you are. But beyond that, it's brand affinity, which is really where the magic happens, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure a lot of people listening have access to large email lists. And those are people who look at your content when you send out a newsletter or whatever. But it's another level of brand affinity when they're hearing someone from your company have these conversations week after week after week. I think it just pulls them in, you know, to build an actual there's a relationship that happens there. There's no other way
Yes.
to explain it.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Paul, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I love that, Chris, because
Mm-hmm.
I know we've had a few conversations leading up to this webinar, and I think one of the things we both agreed that we love about podcasts is there's some weird magic that happens that you just can't do in
Mm-hmm.
text. An example would be I was out for dinner with a friend of mine, and we were talking about podcasting, and he said, the podcast I love the most is where I feel like I'm sat in a coffee shop or a bar with the people on the podcast. It's like some
Mm-hmm.
sort of community experience where they're part of the conversation, but they're just a silent partner. And I think that helps you build a relationship with people in a way that's hard to do through any other channels. I also think there's an aspect of, certainly from sort of people of my age, people who are on the radio are famous and important. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's an element of subconscious association with, if these people are being interviewed on a podcast, or if they're on a podcast, that must mean that people think they're important to listen to. And I think your brain associates a certain level of recognition that comes with
Mm.
that, that I think you can then play off of when you launch a podcast. So that ability to build brand awareness and brand affinity is key. And you can humanize your brand in a way that's very difficult to
Mm-hmm.
do in any other way because of the consistency of a podcast,
Correct.
right? You can do a webinar, and webinars are great, and I love webinars. I think they have a different place from podcasts because
Mm-hmm.
podcasts, as Chris said, is the ability to be in the ears of your target audience every week, just building that relationship. And I've had clients who've come through our website on a form who I don't know, who say, oh, I love the podcast. And I can tell from the way they're speaking with me that they feel like they know me already
Mm-hmm.
because they've listened to some episodes of the podcast. So I think there's just things you can do with podcasts that you can't do through any other medium.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Yeah. It's really interesting. We did have a question from someone in the audience. I know we were talking earlier about downloads, and they wanted to know if downloads are the same as listen or impressions. So, yeah, Chris would like to take a stab at
I think
that.
a download is sort of, you could measure it like an impression. I mean, it means somebody saw it, and really what it means is it got put onto someone's phone. It doesn't mean that someone listened. So that's a bit of the challenge for podcasts, is because they downloaded it, you don't know if they actually listened. If we could measure streams, that would be great. And I guess I
Mm-hmm.
would say you're kind of looking for the graph on the downloads to know that more and more people are paying attention. That's
Excellent. Yeah.
Paul may have more metric data than I have, but
When we've discussed this before, Chris, I think one of the challenges we recognize is how hard it is to measure performance in podcasting. And I think I love the data you showed earlier, Joan, because I think the thing I take away from that is if you can get 100 downloads in 7 days, which doesn't sound very much, right? Then you're in the top 25% of podcasts.
Exactly.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think that means a number of different things. But one of the things I take away from that is downloads are not the be all and end all of podcasting. And if you're going to judge yourself on downloads alone, you're probably not measuring success effectively. And I think also podcasting sadly fits into the old adage of half of my marketing works, I just don't know which half, where it's going to be hard to measure. And the only real way I can think to measure it is unprompted brand awareness surveys and brand credibility surveys like we used to do back in the day to properly measure brand awareness from public relations, media relations activities. That is probably one of the best ways to measure the impact of
Mm-hmm.
your podcast. It's just fairly expensive and involved to do. So I don't know how many people would actually take that approach, but that would probably be a good way to measure impact.
Yeah. So around those measures, I was going to ask you both what internal metrics do you use to measure the success of your own podcasts? So, yeah, Chris.
I'd keep an eye on downloads and so on, but my podcast goes out on Substack, which has essentially a newsletter that goes with it. So I can see how many people, open the email. I can also see how many people forward it. So that tells me a little bit about what they thought about that kind of content. So for every episode, there's a few people who are going to send it to a lot of other people because that's the one for them, right? But I keep an eye on downloads, but I don't over obsess about it. The real feedback, like Paul says, is if someone mentions it on a forum unprompted, that's good feedback. Or they come up to you at an event, or you meet them online and they go, "Oh, I've had people do that during the pandemic. We had one of those speed dating sort of things, and someone
Right.
shows up on my screen and they go like this. Oh, I listened to your podcast. I mean, that's kind of how you know that it's working. You get feedback, or someone emails you and says, "Hey, I didn't think I'd ever find a podcast on this topic."
Oh, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, Paul, anything to share with regards how you measure your own podcast?
Yeah, I completely agree with Chris. We also measure impressions on LinkedIn as the main channel for sharing our podcast. So one of the key things that we do is cut our long form podcasts. So both my podcasts are probably anywhere between 30 to 60 minutes an episode. We can talk about lengths later because I think it's
Yep.
a fascinating topic to go into, but both of our podcasts are that long. So we cut them up into 30-second, maybe a minute long snippets, and we share those on social. And we look at how many reshares, reposts, comments, impressions, engagements that they get, and that's quite helpful. And to be honest, I really have enjoyed and seen great results with that social sharing aspect because I've had people, as Chris said, come up to me at events and say, "Oh, I love the podcast." And I'm like, "Thanks for subscribing. What's your favorite episode?" And they're like, "Oh, no, I don't subscribe. I just saw the videos snippets on social."
Oh,
And in
got
their
it. Yes.
mind, that's being a subscriber of the podcast. And it's another great example for me as to why you can't just rely on downloads to try and estimate your impact, because those people are paying attention to those video snippets in their feed. Maybe they don't even like or click them, right? We can see total minutes viewed when you're in LinkedIn of how long people have spent watching your videos. That's quite a useful metric as well. So I do really love that aspect, but it's the anecdotal bits of the real impact that you can do. I've never had someone come up to me and say, "I really love that ebook you put out," if I'm
I
honest.
was just thinking the same thing. I never said someone say, "Oh, I really love," yeah, exactly. Yeah, the humanizing of the brand, I think is really really important. There's a statement from someone in the audience that said, "Isn't it true that podcasting is a more intimate form of connection with the listener than a webinar? And if so, doesn't it represent a potentially more enduring relationship with one's audience if you're willing to encourage and accept feedback and suggestions?" So I think this speaks, I brought it up now because I think it speaks really well to what you're saying with regards of forming that relationship with the listener, which no other medium can provide. So yeah, that was
Yeah,
a
I
good
love that.
statement.
Yeah,
That's
nothing to add there. That's the essence of podcasting right
Yeah.
there.
And then, I think it's really about, okay, so then if you have that connection, how do you keep it going? Do either of you put any kind of forms on your podcasting, for feedback, or do you get feedback in other ways? Because that was a second part to that question that was just posed.
People can comment on my podcast pages. I will tell
Perfect.
you,
Okay.
but I don't see it there. I see it maybe where Paul sees it on LinkedIn. That's where
On
the commenting
LinkedIn. Okay.
happens.
Okay.
I rarely get a comment on the podcast page where I publish it. It's always
Right.
on LinkedIn where I share a clip and then, it goes to their network, right? And then that's where the conversation happens.
Exactly. Perfect. Anything to add there, Paul?
No, that's the same
Okay.
for us. Yeah, especially if I try and choose, or the team that works on this, we try and choose video snippets that we feel are going to be a bit provocative or
Right, right.
controversial, or that are going to stimulate conversation, in order to try and trigger that type of engagement. So I think there's an art to podcasting, but there's even just a micro art inside the art to choosing those little social video snippets in order to be able to really get interest online. And there are some AI driven tools that have emerged to try and automate this process. But for me, they don't quite have the creative skill to really understand what's going to resonate with an audience. So we still do all of that manually. But yeah, that's a great way to try and get people to provide feedback on the podcast.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So we have lots of many reasons why companies should consider starting podcasting if they're not already. So let's say someone decides, hey, I'm going to go for it. I want to start a podcast. What kind of advice can you give for someone to get started? Like, is there technology that they utilize, and what sort of investment, time, and resources does one need to start producing podcasts? So, Paul, would you like to answer that first?
Do you know what? Just before we get into that question,
Sure.
can I share a little secret?
Yes, of
Okay.
course.
But no one outside of this webinar can tell anyone that I told you this. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
One of the main reasons I started my other podcast is because I wanted to further strengthen the relationships I had with people in the industry and build new relationships. That podcast is called Life Science and Marketing. And if it gets no downloads at all, I don't care, because I leverage it as an opportunity to have conversations with current clients and prospective clients. And I use it as an opportunity to engage with people that I want to learn about Biostrata, but to do it in a really fun and productive way where we just chew the fat on life science and marketing on the podcast. So if we didn't get any downloads, I'm still building relationships with all of those people. And that's kind of one of the key reasons that we did it. So I wanted to tell that little secret before we move into the how to do it. But
thank you.
But Chris, you've been doing this a lot longer than me. I know you've surfed technology evolution along that time as well. So what does your setup look like?
First of all, I wish I had come up with the name Life Science and Marketing. I'll just say that. I mean, I did my name for SEO reasons, and that was a good one. But when I saw yours, I said, you win. The technology, it's gone from, first of all audio to now where you can record high quality video online, right? So, and it's, so I don't know, I think you also use Riverside for your recording. And if you haven't looked at Riverside, it's basically Zoom, but it records everybody separately and locally. So if there's a internet hiccup, it doesn't show up in the recording. That's the simple thing. So if you have a laptop, I mean, there are many ways to record it, but Riverside's sort of the industry standard. It's inexpensive. Don't buy the enterprise account. And then but the others are Squadcast, which is now integrated into Descript, which is the editing software I use. And I only moved from Squadcast into Riverside because Riverside was a little ahead at one point. But now I would probably just get Descript, which makes editing super easy. It's like editing a Word document. You get an automated transcript, and you can do anything you want with it.
Fantastic.
I could talk for an hour about what it will do, but so now you can record and edit in the same software, basically.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, those tips are great. So if somebody wants to start, what about time and resource commitments? Can one person do this? Do you need a team? Yeah, if a company wanted to start. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I think the power of tools like Descript that Chris is describing, I think does democratize this in terms of it's fairly easy to pick up the skills necessary. So we don't outsource any high-end technical production or anything to a dedicated podcasting or video production agency, for example. I think Descript makes that much easier to do. That doesn't tell you how to create a good podcast and promote it and get results through it, but it's
which
easier
we'll get to later.
All right, which is probably where the magic really happens, but it makes it easier to edit it. So we're using those tools as well, but it's still a sizable commitment, if I'm honest. So on artificially intelligent marketing, it goes out every week, sometimes every 2 weeks. Consistency is something we can probably talk about later because it's important and I wish we could be more consistent, but I would probably invest 6 hours a week in sort of reviewing. It's probably more like 8 hours a week in reviewing stories that we're going to talk about, putting together a quick script, recording the episode, and then editing it. And then my colleague Martin is probably gathering stories as well, and he does all the social snippets and all the social sharing. So he's probably doing another sort of 4, 6, 8 hours as well. So over that week to 2 week period, we're probably investing about 16 hours each in the sort of recording, scripting, promotion process, because he sends out an email newsletter and he uses the transcript from the podcast to automatically write a blog post using GPT-4. I think he's using Claude now, actually. But so we've got a process by which we also automate some aspects using AI to try and get the time down a bit. But it's certainly not the sort of thing that you can just turn up for an hour and, at least in my experience, and get it done. What do you think, Chris? Because you've got a bit more experience across different types of podcasts.
Yeah, I'm probably at the other end of the spectrum in terms of, so my process for my own podcast is typically I meet somebody, I have an idea. Often we're just having a conversation on a phone and they'll say something and I think, that's interesting. I'll bet a lot of other people would like to hear about that. Would you do a podcast with me? And then I typically have a pre-interview, as I have done with both of you, to just figure out where are we going with this whole thing. When I haven't, I can do it now for some people without a pre-interview, but so that's sometimes 20 minutes to a half hour at most.
Okay.
And then I figure out what I want to talk about. I send them the questions in the invitation. It's another half hour to record it. Editing, I probably don't spend more than a half hour actually editing the audio for most episodes. And then it's the writing of the blog. So I'm not using, I have used ChatGPT a couple times and I tried to make it sound like me. And I got feedback from a friend and listener who said, I still knew it wasn't you. So, but the writing takes the most part. But I would say, at most I'm spending 1 day per episode, 8 hours per episode.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good framework between the two, depending on the usage and stuff. So, let's talk about, we touched upon in your answers, you touched upon a little bit around, so somebody says, yeah, I'm going to do a podcast. So let's talk about the content generation. So how do you consistently generate ideas for content, whether it's recruiting a guest, like you said, Chris, you have a conversation with someone, you say, hey, that would be really interesting. And so what's your methods about trying to, determining what kind of content, what to cover?
So you and I did an episode on a content calendar, and I will
We did.
confess that I do not have one.
Okay.
I think everybody else should pay attention to you, though.
No.
So I started with my friends. I started putting things on LinkedIn. My first one, then I got feedback from a scientist on LinkedIn about marketing and what he thought. And he had a different point of view. So I said, why don't you come on?
Right.
And then so it's having those conversations with people that come out of who knows where, or looking on LinkedIn and I find someone who's interesting that I want to talk to. I'm not specifically looking for podcast guests, but I'm looking for people I want to talk to. And those things, they come up.
Merge.
And then I ask your current guest, who else should I talk to? So I don't have a big long-term vision for who should be on. I just look for people that know something that I want to know more about. That's
okay. Great. And you do that organically through discussion. Do you use any other tools to help, news sources or tools to help you determine?
not really. I mean, I have gotten to the point, I will say, now I get pitched for.
Oh, I can imagine.
So PR agencies
Totally.
come to me and say, and once in a while they actually have a good pitch. Like they all say they listen to my podcast, and then the next paragraph actually lets me know whether they did or not. And,
Right.
and some of if it's relevant and I can make it relevant for life science, they don't have to be from life science, but it has to be something that would be of interest to my audience.
Okay. Fantastic. How about yourself, Paul? How do you go about deciding what topics you cover and making sure they're relevant and engaging?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. With one of my podcasts, I get to cheat. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. But one of the things I think Chris does really well, and I think is exceptionally hard to do, is to have a podcast that has a consistent theme so that when you're a subscriber to it, you kind of know what you're going to get, but enough variation in the content that it's interesting enough that every episode is different in some way and makes you go, and sort of triggers your mind in different ways. And I think if you can find that space in the middle of those two poles, I think you've done really well. And I think people will be engaged and they'll want to keep coming back for more and more episodes. I would say neither of my podcasts quite achieves that. One of them doesn't need to, because artificially intelligent marketing is mostly driven by what happened in AI last week.
Okay.
So all of the topic, and that's where most of the time investment comes for us, is actually in gathering those stories, picking out what's important, summarizing them, and then pulling out the so what for marketers. And that's quite a lot of work and effort, to be honest. And the main mechanisms are Google Alerts, Twitter lists that I use, Reddit and subreddits that I scan. I'm on about 12 really good AI general newsletters that we pull the marketing specific parts out of, and then we sort of figure out what the main stories are that we're going to do. For the other podcast, Life Science and Marketing, I have a set of questions that guides almost every interview. And my hope is I will only need 10% of them. Because what I really want is to find that trigger point in the interviewee that's clearly something they're passionate about or have deep expertise in, and then just dive deep into that. And as I say to each guest that comes on before we begin, because they know the questions ahead of time as well, because I think it gives them a bit more confidence that they know what they're going to need to say. But I say to them, look, if we don't get past question 2, I see that as a success, and that's a podcast win for me, because it means we probably went down some rabbit hole somewhere that's going to be really interesting because it's going to be unique to them and their experiences. What I really don't want is every podcast episode to be some sort of version of this is how I optimize my email for click-through rate, right? Because we can all go find that online. What I really want is, do you know what? The campaign that we did that sort of struck the biggest chord with customers was this thing for some of these random reasons that we never could have predicted. Or do you know what? My best campaign ever was because we did this specific type of market research before we launched the campaign, and we've never done it again since. And I wish we would, because these were the results that we got. And so I think it's just finding that uniqueness is hard.
Well, it sounds like a lot of work and effort on your part goes into that, to make sure that the content's engaging. So let's say you picked a topic, either you or Chris or Paul, and were you ever like blown away, surprised at how popular it was? Did you?
Yeah,
did you think,
actually, I was going to tag on to what Paul was saying there. So first of all, thank you, Paul, for your kind words on that. And because that is, I was going to bring that up. That is kind of what I try to do, and we can talk about that down the road. Surprised by how it goes. This is the funny thing. You never know. You absolutely never know how it's going to go. And there are episodes where I have almost not published because I thought, I'm not sure if this is any good, but it's all I have today. And I publish it, and I get an email back. It says, thank you so much. That was exactly what I needed.
Okay.
So it's not, and then there are some people you interview and you think, this is it. This is the one that's going to, get me to start selling Casper mattresses. No. Like, you just have no idea. You just keep going. It's a long game, and you just have to show up every time. That's how you win, is over the long haul.
Excellent. How about you, Paul? Were any episodes that you were just like, wow, I was so shocked that resonated well?
I find by most of the metrics that we can use that most of our episodes on artificially intelligent marketing get consistently listened to.
It's consistent. Okay, that's good to know. It's going to be another question. Yeah.
And I think that's because for the people who know about it, it's like we're just save them 20 hours a week. Like, do you want to know how AI is going to impact your job and how you can use it to get ahead in your career? Don't do 20 hours a week of work, do 45 minutes of work. And hopefully there'll be some fun and banter as well, because Martin and I try and inject a bit of personality into it to make it enjoyable. So that tends to be quite consistent. Life science and marketing, it's like Chris said, and I mostly see it in the social snippets. I've got a social snippet where I'm like, this is provocative. It's going to get loads of comments. It's going to get loads of likes. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And then there are things where I share it and I'm like, oh, I wonder if this is kind of like obvious. And maybe people will be like, well, of course that's true. And some of those have been the ones that have really struck a chord with people, because people just, I think they get that sense of, yes, good, it's not just me that has experienced that, or that thinks that's true, or that thinks that's the right way to do something. So I'm trying to spot the trends, but I'm like Chris with those. Sometimes ones blow up and other ones just don't work at all that you think are going to be brilliant.
Yeah, that's great. I think the takeaway message is try, right? I mean, just, go for it. If you think something's interesting, don't yeah, put it out there and see what happens.
I like
Yeah,
what Paul said about artificially intelligent. So he has a thing that is educating people on something that's hard to keep on top of. Like,
right.
good on you for that. And that's going to be an essential resource. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one way to have what I would think is a surefire hit. I'll tell people, people who've listened to my podcast know this is how I measure a podcast, and it has nothing to do with downloads. It happens while I'm doing the interview. My cheeks hurt because I'm smiling so much, and I think I can't believe how much good stuff this person is sharing with me, and I'm having fun. And then I
My
go,
cheeks are
that's
hurting.
that's it, and I feel that way today. So
Good. Yeah, absolutely. So much. Yeah, I think we have like 20 minutes left. So I wanted to, yeah, we could probably go on forever talking about this, which is great. But, and building off of the theme that we had just discussed, right? Content, what type of content. It's at what point do you think about audience? So let's say someone's going to start building a podcast, or even if they have a podcast, how much work do you put in understanding your audience so that does that help guide you with the content? If you can kind of speak to that a little bit, Paul, that would be great. And then Chris.
Yeah. I look at a podcast like I look at a product,
Mm-hmm.
right? Can you identify your niche? Can you identify the value proposition and make it as unique as possible? And is that niche, is it big enough to make it worthwhile doing a podcast? So I
Mm-hmm.
think if all of those things are true, then you're probably in a good start. The challenge is there are so many things that contribute to whether a podcast is really good or not.
Mm-hmm.
I, as to whether you'll be really successful, I think it's really hard to predict from the outset. And I think that what a lot of podcasters find is that they're not an overnight success and it's hard to then maintain momentum. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in one of our pre-calls for this, we talked a bit about how when we were doing our podcast, Artificially Intelligent Marketing, and we weren't getting many downloads to begin with. And a friend of mine sent me a message and he was like 80, some crazy stat, like 90% of podcasts don't get past episode 6.
Mm-hmm.
So you're already better than 90% of podcasts because you've
There you
made
go.
it right, because you've been consistent. So I think there's also an element of identifying the audience, figuring out why you're going to be unique and interesting, and then staying the course for a while to
Mm-hmm.
give yourself a chance to have an impact. I think you have to combine that with exceptional promotion activity, and you should we'll talk about this in a bit, at least as much
Yes.
effort into promotion as production. But yeah, I guess that's what I would say on that. What do you think,
Mm-hmm.
Chris?
yeah, I mean, so when I started Life Science Marketing Radio, I had a very clear idea of who my audience were. And they're people like you and I and all the people I hope listening, the SAMPS audience,
Mm-hmm.
people who are in marketing and life science, who, the jobs I've had, what would I like to have had a resource for? So that was pretty clear. That one was pretty easy. I've done other podcasts that very my science podcast is a little more broad, and so
Mm-hmm.
I hope it's interesting to people in the life sciences broadly, but it's more about different aspects of science that I'm curious about. So that's it. The metric that you hinted at early on that we really haven't made clear is it's the number of content assets you can produce from a single interview. I just want to make sure that that's clear. So you have an audience,
Mm-hmm.
but beyond downloads, you're generating all kinds of content off the back of it that would have taken a lot longer otherwise by sticking a blank sheet of paper in front of some subject matter expert's face.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. Talking about content extensions. What are some examples of let's dive into that a little bit more. What are some examples that you currently utilize? So after you do a podcast, you said you write a blog. Are there any others?
Well, all the snippets,
Snippets?
the
Okay.
questions and answers that you can
Yep.
share on LinkedIn. You can use ChatGPT to summarize for your blog.
Mm-hmm.
You can pull static images and do an image of the speaker and a pull quote.
Mm-hmm. Well, these
Um,
are great ideas.
yeah, all
Yeah.
those things, and YouTube Shorts.
Mm-hmm.
If you're Instagram, I mean, I watch Instagram, so I had to take it off my phone because I was spending too much time watching stories. But the nice thing about the YouTube Shorts, and I don't do it enough, but I have tested it. you get a lot of views with absolutely no effort at all. And then hopefully it
Mm.
can drive people back to the full length episode or whatever the other
Hmm.
piece of content you're looking for.
Excellent.
I'm,
How about yourself, Paul? Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned YouTube Shorts, Chris, because Martin did some experimentation with that. And some of our videos, coming back to your point, what's going to blow up and what's not, some of our snippet videos were getting like 10,000 views and others were getting like 50. And we couldn't tell why. And we're still trying to figure out the algorithm. But that's the type of penetrance that you can get just by exploring some of those channels, which I think is definitely worth keeping in mind.
Hmm. Excellent. And so let's talk a little bit about, okay, the content extensions. Paul, you touched a little bit about promotion, so I want to make sure we spend adequate time kind of talking through any tips and tricks you have. Okay, you start the podcast, you have content, you have someone to interview, you have material. How do you let the world know about it?
This
So
is
yeah.
so important because I think we spend 80% of the time on production of our podcast and 20% on promotion. And I think it should be the other way around. So put
Hmm.
our hands up and say that do as we say, don't do as we do. I think the other thing, just tying this back to your last question as well, is I think if you can take a step back and take quite a strategic view on your podcast, you can probably build a promotional plan that's very integrated. So, one of the things we want to do at some point for artificially intelligent marketing is we're going to do a series of special episodes on different aspects of marketing. So, AI for social, AI for blogging, AI for podcasting, AI for data analysis. And then at some point, we'll have a blog post on all those topics because we can drive it out of the transcripts. But then at some point,
Hmm.
we'll have a long form piece of content like a white paper or an ebook or something more substantial, because all of those episodes will effectively form a chapter of that sort of ebook.
Hmm.
Plus, if if the content's really high value, we can package it up and sell it as a course,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
So there's all these different opportunities, but what that does is gives you lots of high value assets to promote, which I think is key. But I think the thing that we don't do on the promotion side that I wish that we did more was more proactively trying to get on podcast directories. So all you need to do is Google AI podcasts, and you're going to find a bunch of blogs that are clearly well respected by the Google's algorithm, and then go pitch those people and say, "Hey, do you want to list our podcast?" Like that would be so
Mm.
easy to do. We haven't done it yet. Um, I think if you get guests on your podcast that have strong networks of their own, you can use network effects to promote your podcast, because
Hmm.
the most shared and viewed snippets for life science and marketing every single time is the first video snippet that we do of the interviewee that they themselves then share, because all of their colleagues and friends are like, "Oh, has been on a podcast. This is so cool." And they all comment and they all like and they all share. So having guests and encouraging them to share is a great way to promote the podcast as well. So I think
Hmm.
that's absolutely important. Most podcasts, ourselves included, don't do enough of asking people to subscribe and share. Like, there's some data out there. I can't remember. Maybe I'll find it and we can share it to the SAMPS audience, showing
Hmm.
that just by asking people to subscribe and share, the amount of subscribers leaps up, because people are like, "Oh
Oh,
yeah,
that makes sense.
I can get more of this if I just hit the subscribe button." That's why when
Right.
you're on YouTube, you can hear people going,
Hmm.
"Please subscribe." It's because all the data says it makes your subscribe rates go up higher. So there's so many different things you could do, and we don't do enough of them personally. I mean, Chris, what are your thoughts on promoting a podcast effectively?
Yeah, so across the podcasting industry, you'll hear this from other podcasters. The number one way to get your pod to grow your podcast is to trade with another podcaster, to get on
Mm.
theirs and they get on yours.
Hmm.
Because if people, of course, who have similar audiences, that's number one. And then my main strategy for most of the time that I've been doing my own podcast, because we're in a niche, right? So now we're talking about those podcasts that have 141 downloads in the first, you know, month or so. We're not getting huge numbers, but we have a niche. And that means if someone's listening to Paul's podcast or they're listening to my podcast, they're the type of person that works with at least two other people who should also be listening to that podcast. So
Right.
that was my call to action forever. It's just been, hey, if you like this, there's a person in a cubicle next to you that should also be listening.
Oh, that's great advice.
So
No,
tell
thank
two
you.
people every episode, tell two other people that you like it.
No, that's fantastic. No, really good tips on promotion. And so with the 10 minutes remaining, I'd like to focus the rest of the discussion on, okay, so you're sharing your experiences. This is great. But now, the people that are attending this webinar, they work for tool providers and such. So like how would they might go about using podcasts to strengthen their brand or promote a product? Like Paul, what kind of advice do you give your customers at the agency if they're thinking about starting a podcast?
Yeah. So I think fundamentally for me, it comes back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast in terms of how can you raise awareness of your company, your brand, your products, your technology, and most of all, your experts
Okay.
with your target audience in a human, authentic way that is ahead of the curve of all of the AI generated content that's either there or coming, which is all a remix of stuff that's already been written. Whereas what we really want to help them share is the expertise that's in the head of all of their subject matter experts, which isn't written down anywhere and cannot be accessed any other way. And it's incredibly hard to duplicate, right? If you've got a particular number of experts in your business that you know are just really, really industry thought leaders, this is a great way to tap into them, whilst also cascading that content out through other range of tactics and channels through all of the remixing and repurposing opportunities that we've described. I think the other way we look at it is if you have a customer base
Right.
of
That's what I was going to
experts,
ask. Totally.
and how can you bring them into the mix as well, for all my sort of little secret earlier in terms of building, you can use it as a sales and business development tool to build those relationships. But also in our industry, there are so many fascinating
So
people. I mean,
many.
Chris's podcast is testament to this. There are so many fascinating people doing incredible stuff that it's just so much fun to listen to them for 30 minutes. Well, do that through your own podcast, and I bet you'll attract other people that also want to listen.
Yeah, I really like the customer component because I like, internal and external expertise, right? The companies can establish, themselves as thought leaders, humanize the brand, but bringing in external customers, I think, is a fabulous idea because then it shows, association with a KOL potentially. So that could be a really good strategy. How about yourself, Chris? What advice would you give your
Yeah, so
customers?
all your customers can be KOLs. I mean, they
Right.
all presumably have some different area, slightly different area of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, since we're on this topic, and internal experts also, whatever they know is, I'm sure, very useful to your audience. But my main tip is no one wants to hear about your product. You
Right.
have to frame it in a different way. So you could do a whole podcast on single cell biology or spatial biology or any other aspect you want, but don't talk about your product because that will kill it. But
Yeah.
you can imagine, I mean, people go to conferences to learn all those things. Now you're having a conference every week or every other week on your own podcast, and you can go to conferences and talk to a lot of people and find more guests. You could
Mm-hmm.
record a bunch of podcasts at a conference. So that's my main advice would
Yeah.
be,
Do you
but
find
all,
that? Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry. No,
no, there's,
yeah, I was curious there. Do you find that people are more like, do you get a good, when you invite someone to participate in your podcast, do you get a pretty high acceptance rate? I know sometimes at the webinar, there's more commitment if there's a deck that they have to, but this is just a conversation. So I was just wondering if you find a pretty high acceptance rate when you reach out
yeah.
to someone.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I could probably count on both hands the number of people who said no, maybe on one hand. It's
Mm-hmm.
just very rare. You know, I've had some people say, I'm just not comfortable, or in one case, somebody said, I don't think my company would let me, but that was pretty exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Most people say, yeah, why not? I'd love to do that.
Yeah. How about yourself, Paul? Do you get a pretty high acceptance rate?
Yeah, it's basically 100%. I think the only
Okay.
times you get a no is what Chris was saying. But I think
Mm-hmm.
as the person organizing the podcast, you can do a number of things to ensure that. right? Like we talked about giving the questions ahead of time. I think there's a lot
Right.
of things you can do to make people feel comfortable. There's a lot of modest experts in our industry that are like, "Oh, why would anybody want to listen to me?" And I think sometimes you just need to encourage them to come have a conversation. And once they forget that they're
Hmm.
being recorded, most people in my experience just then excel because there's just two people having a conversation where they happen to be an expert in something. They don't have to think about the answers.
Hmm.
Right? They know the answers to what they do every day. And sometimes you just have to enable that to happen.
Hmm.
So you can even make the most sort of nervous person, I think, comfortable with the process if you give them enough confidence and structure that this is not going to be a problem. And one of the big things I do at the beginning of my podcast is I say, this isn't live. If we're recording this and
Oh,
you
yeah.
want to say it a different way, or you're like, oh, crumbs, I don't think my boss would like it if I said that, we'll just start. We'll have another go. I'll edit it
Hmm.
out. Nothing's going to go live until you get to check it. You're going to listen to the whole podcast before we make it live. You've got full control over what gets published. So basically, you just take risk and effort as close to zero as you can get.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Does anyone ever ask you for something in return, like payment, or do you ever, or,
I have had someone ask me for payment to
okay,
be, they wanted me to pay them to be on the podcast, and I just said no.
right.
But and it was interesting, but yeah, most people are comfortable. I mean, honestly, the pandemic has probably opened up the door for
Yes,
everybody because everyone has seen
absolutely.
themselves on a computer screen talking to a bunch of people now. So it's just another day.
I know. Yeah, I absolutely, absolutely. My goodness, I can't believe how time has flown. We just have a few minutes left. I'm just going to poke through questions from the audience. This has really been very, very insightful. Is there anything I didn't ask that you'd like to state, as tips or tricks or anything you feel we didn't cover, Chris or Paul, that you'd like to add a few more words of wisdom?
Um, no, I would just say that, it's not that hard to make a podcast. I mean, Paul touched on it about, have a theme for your podcast, but sometimes
Mm-hmm.
try different things. So, the Life Science Marketing podcast, largely about marketing, but every marketer has to build a team. So I've done episodes on how do you recruit the right people and
Mm-hmm.
so on like that, or leadership things, which is relevant regardless. So that keeps people engaged, and it doesn't have to be about how to optimize your emails every week. So um, that's what I would say. And then, just get comfortable asking people questions. Be curious. That's how you do it.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank
Right.
you so much. How about yourself, Paul? Any parting words of wisdom?
Yeah, I
Sure we
think
haven't covered.
people over worry about this stuff. Like the two most
Hmm.
used phrases I have with my team on this is progress over perfection and don't let perfect be the enemy of done. Because if
I
there's a
love it.
bunch if there's a bunch of people held back, like say all your competitors are like, oh, we do a podcast, but it sounds hard. I got to think about all this stuff. Well, then they're not doing it. And my favorite thing about podcasting is it's as we saw from the data you showed us earlier, Joan, it's been around
Hmm.
for a long time. Can you think of 10 brilliant life science podcasts that you listen to? I can't. I mean, I'm sure they're there. But
Hmm.
what that says to me is there is a space for you to go and occupy with your audience
Hmm.
because other people, it's maybe on their too hard pile or they haven't thought about it. And what
Oh,
we're here to
good.
tell you today is it's not too hard. It's actually relatively easy. And once you get started, you'll get into the groove and you'll be building relationships with prospects and audiences in a way that you can't really do with any other format.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's really great advice. Well, unfortunately, our time is up, but it's been a really brilliant discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you for those who joined. Thank you for your great questions. I hope you got a lot out of this. There were some comments with regards to putting together like a list of tips and tricks or a list of resources that you use. I will be creating a blog post as a result of this webinar, and I'll be, if you don't mind, Chris and Paul, I'll be asking you for some advice and things that I can include. I know you mentioned some during the webinar, but so yeah, we'll cover that in the blog post. So thank you both for joining us. We really appreciate it on behalf of SAMPS. And again, those listening, if you found it useful, thank you. We hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be April 18th, all around AI and a discussion on ethics. So Paul, I think we'll see you there, hopefully. And
I'll be on that one. Yeah.
yeah, well, listen, thank you both so much. It was really an honor and a pleasure to have this discussion with you. And I thought it was so insightful. So
Well,
thank you
thank you,
all.
Beth.
Okay, take
Thanks for
care,
having me.
everyone. Thank you.
See
Cheers.
y'all.
Bye. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.